Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the TA call that we do every year about this time to walk you through the clarification process. I want to thank you all for the excellent work you've done developing this year's SPP APRs. I just did some calculation. This is the 17th year for SPP APR submission. We recognize this is a major undertaking for states at a time when there are multiple demands for your time and effort. We appreciate the careful attention paid to reporting the required indicator data and narratives. And we hope this is more than just a checkoff, that this is a useful activity for you and your colleagues, and that the compilation of data and analysis help you identify your state's progress and appreciate that, as well as locate or identify areas where more attention is needed. As you know, OSEP has completed its pre-clarification reviews. The Part C reviews were released on Tuesday and Part B today. During this call, we'll explain the clarification process and suggest areas where you might want to pay particular attention. Leading us through the call today will be Christine Pilgrim, who is the Associate Division Director assigned to this task, and Sharon Loza, who's the Implementation Team Facilitator for the Data Implementation Team. And I think this marks Sharon's first anniversary at OSEP or somewhere in that area. So I want to acknowledge the incredible effort that Sharon and Christine have done to lead staff through this process. I want to acknowledge the MSIP state leads, but especially the data IT members who've put in long hours to meet the pre-clarification timelines in order to release our responses to you on time. So I will turn it over then to Sharon Loza. Sharon?
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for those warm welcome comments, and good afternoon, everyone. As Greg mentioned, we're going to take a few minutes just to be talking about this year's clarification process and some information for you all to pay attention to. So welcome and thanks again. So this is just an overview and a quick look at our agenda for today. We're going to cover the first two items fairly quickly so that we have more time to discuss the OSEP responses you all are reviewing. Again, as mentioned, if you have questions as we go, please enter them in the Q&A. We will be monitoring that and responding how we can. Our team will respond to as many of those as we can, but in case we don't have enough time, we will be sure to follow up with you all individually. So, as we mentioned, we have officially entered this year's clarification period. Thank you, Greg, for providing us kind of that overview of where we are. For Part C states, those were released on Tuesday and just earlier this week. And Part B states, again, our comments were available starting today. So it's important to pay attention to the ending dates of the clarification period, as this will be the deadline for making any changes. We'll talk more about that in the next few slides, but wanted to make sure that these dates were at the top of mind for you all to be paying attention to. So, again, at this point, the responses are available. And or if you've begun to review those or when you do, it's important to look at all of the language. As you have questions or need clarification, please make note of that so you'll be able to talk with your state lead during your clarification calls should you choose to have one. It also might be helpful to include other members of your team who have been involved in data collection or the analysis involved for the SPP APR submission. Also, your TA providers who can assist you with also reviewing those responses and potentially clarifying OSEP expectations. Another thing that may be helpful as you're reviewing responses is to send your questions to your state lead in advance of your call, so that way they can be better prepared to respond to any specific questions that you might have and or get more resources that can help. So moving on to the clarification change form. That form can be accessed through the SPPAPR Community of Practice website, and PSC also will be sending out an email about that. On the form, you'll want to ensure that all the revisions made in the EMAP system are reflected on the change form. This is important as OSEP tracks any and all changes between APR submissions. When completing the change form, the changes should be listed by indicator, and you'll see an example of that on the next slide. So we've listed preferred naming conventions when attaching the clarification change form in EMAPs. And again, this helps quickly identify the form in the system. So as I mentioned, let's take a quick look at an example of a clarification change form. So here you'll see the items we just discussed. You don't need to go into too many details for each change. However, it is to be clear enough to signal the major changes that you've made in your submission. A final note about the clarification change form. This isn't going to be publicly posted, so therefore it doesn't need to be 508 compliant. That requirement is not necessary. So lastly, before we get into OSEP responses, a final reminder about the resubmission deadlines for clarification changes. You have your dates here. And remember, if you choose to provide additional information as a result of OSEP responses, please be sure to update the actual SPPAPR in the system, and also document the corrections using the clarification change form, which needs to be attached to the FYS SPPAPR submission. So now I'll turn it over to Christine, who will provide a couple of reminders and talk about our OSEP responses. Christine?
Thanks, Sharon. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. I also echo Greg's words about how much we appreciate the hard work everyone put into their SPP APR submission. I am part of an incredible team that worked extremely hard to get our responses back to you on the dates that they were promised. So also a big thanks and shout out to my team. So good work all around. I just wanted to spend the next few slides, so hopefully won't take too long, going through some cross-cutting reminders. So reminders for both those who are working in Part B programs as well as Part C, and then some reminders for specific indicators within each sort of program before we close out. And as a reminder, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A and we will get to them either as we're going along or at the end. We'll take a stop and review those. So one sort of flag and clarification that's not noted on the slide, but I had a few questions today after the Part B email went out to signal that clarification had started. So I just figured it would be good to just clear a few things up for everyone here now that we're on together. I think the wording of the email that went out to Part B state directors might not have been super clear. So just wanted to clarify that when you download your DocX from the system, there are going to be some bits of information in the determinations enclosure section. So when you download your DocX, in that section, you're going to find your data rubric, your complete data rubric. You're going to see a blank template for the RDA matrix. This is the blank template from last year's RDA matrix. I don't want anyone to look and assume that based on this blank template, that reflects our decisions for how we're making determinations in 2024. You would remember that last year and the year before, we signaled in our determination letters that we were thinking about some changes we may make to prioritize issues of equity, et cetera. Those conversations are still happening internally. So that blank matrix isn't an indication of where we've landed. It's just the blank matrix that we used last year. So any decisions we make, any changes we make that we flagged we were considering would be reflected in the final, our ed final review that goes back out to you when we issue determinations. Also wanted to flag that there is language in the how the department made determination section of that determinations enclosure part of the DocX, and it just links to, the link isn't live yet, but it just in essence says that when we post the 2024 determinations, that's the link it's going to be at. So I didn't want anyone to make any assumptions of what is or is not, because some of those pieces are in the determinations enclosure section. So now back to the slide. You would remember last year when we issued determinations and at Leadership and Project Directors Conference last year, and in a few other venues, we have really been hitting home that with EdFacts modernization, that you and the impact on the 618 data submission. So we flagged in determination letters last year that we are using the data as of the due date for all of our processes, right? Those were the data that were going to be pre-filled in the SPP APR. It's the data as of the due date that we use in determinations, and on the RDA matrix, it's the data as of the due date that we use in all of our public release products. So just want to remind you that there is no resubmission period with EdFacts modernization. States can request a correction opportunity in select circumstances, and there's an entire process for that. But I want to remind you that even if you requested a correction opportunity and that was approved, the data in the system is only going to be the data as of the due date. And it's the data as of the due date that we're using for all of our processes. Another just sort of general reminder based on things that we were seeing across submissions is that the radio buttons in the system are pretty important. And we expect that part of your reporting is checking the applicable radio buttons before you submit to us. There are times when failing to check those radio buttons affect how we can analyze your data for validity and reliability. There are times when failing to check the applicable button means that the system will not display what it needs to display in terms of your data. I can give you a good example of that in the dispute resolution indicators, so C9, 10, B15, and 16. If you don't indicate whether or not you use a target range, if you fail to check the radio button indicating that, your FFY 2022 SPP APR data table will not display in the system. So for a number of reasons, you checking your radio buttons is very, very important. So please make sure that you are attending to those. Also, just want to make sure, I'm sure everyone has on their team that individual that has the most eagle of eyes, maybe. You want to check to make sure that your submissions are internally consistent. Sometimes there are discrepancies when you cut and paste from a previous submission. So it might reference the wrong reporting year. It might reference the wrong regulatory requirements. Their numbers different from the data table, the narrative. All of those things call into question the internal consistency of your submission, which then make us question validity and reliability of data. So you just want to make sure that that you attend to all of those things during this clarification period and before you submit back to us. And now let's talk about a few of these clarification responses. So to my Part B friends right now, you would remember that last year for your FFY 2021 submissions that we analyzed indicator 4A and 4B in all SPP APR submissions using the direction that was provided in OSEP's discipline guidance that was released in July of 2022. Specifically for that, for last year's submission, when we were reviewing, we looked at each state submission, looked at the threshold that a state uses to determine if an LEA has a significant discrepancy in the rates of long-term suspensions and expulsions for children with disabilities, including by race and ethnicity. And for those submissions last year, we reviewed all of the thresholds used by states and found that the median was was 3 times the comparison group. So as a result, in our required actions last year, we asked states that used a threshold that was above that median of 3 times the comparison group to explain how its methodology is reasonably designed. Also, last year, when we reviewed submissions, we asked states that included a very low percentage of LEAs in their analysis to explain how the methodology is reasonably designed. And after we reviewed all of those submissions last year, we issued a required action for any state that included 10% or fewer of its LEAs in its analysis. This year, OSEP's analysis is consistent with the approach that we took last year for your FFY 2021 submissions. So we're applying the same bar, same analysis, same approach. As we look across all of the pre-clarification submissions, so your initial submissions, we do want to recognize and honor the fact that there are many states that have worked very hard over the last several months to revise their methodology. Many states engaged with their stakeholders to discuss indicator 4A and 4B and whether changes should be made to address the significant discrepancies in the long-term suspensions or expulsions for children with disabilities that may be occurring in LEAs. OSEP appreciates the effort that states have made to reflect on their methodology and their process. We have seen that many states have made revisions to their methodology for this FFY 2022 submission this year, and other states have noted in this year's submissions that they plan to anticipate making revisions in the future. Again, we appreciate the time, the energy, and the effort and focus that states have spent on this topic. When we look at the different OSEP responses that have been issued in response to this year's submission, it's important to know that OSEP is applying the same analysis in FFY 2022 that we did in 2021, which I've said about 3 times now so that you guys remember. So everything that we talked about earlier that I explained earlier, flagging once again, same approach, same analysis. So we want to make sure that you know that if a state has revised its methodology, that methodology continues to prompt an OSEP response. What you're going to see in our language is an acknowledgement that you've revised your methodology, but also acknowledgement that the revised methodology continues to use a threshold above the median of thresholds used by other states, and or you're including only a very low percentage of LEAs in the state's analysis. So your takeaway from this slide is OSEP is applying the same approach to this year's analysis as we did last year. We're acknowledging all of the good work that many states have done to revise their methodology, to be thoughtful, to engage with stakeholders, et cetera. And however, even if you did revise your methodology, if it's still triggering in those 2 areas based on the bar we used last year, you would still be getting OSEP response this year. Now a little bit of a discussion with some Part C indicators and as well as the OSEP, which is cuts across both programs. So C3 and B7, so let's think about outcomes for a minute. We continue to take a closer look at the reported number of infants and toddlers with IFSPs or 3 to 5-year-olds, preschoolers with IEPs assessed, and the summary statement 2 denominators in each of the 3 outcome areas. So we would expect to see that the summary statement 2 denominators represent the total number of children assessed. And so when we see those numbers reported differently, it leads us to ask you for some more information about that discrepancy. There are 3 ways that we would sort of call that discrepancy out and ask for additional information. First, it's if the total number assessed isn't reported at all, we're going to ask you to report it as required. If the 3 denominators match, but they don't match the total number reported assessed, we'll ask you for some additional information to clarify the discrepancy. And third, if there's no consistency at all across all the denominators and the number assessed. If nothing matches, we're going to also ask you for that additional clarification regarding the discrepancy. Moving on to compliance indicators for Part C, C1, C7, and C8, A, B, and C. As required in the measurement table for all of those compliance indicators, states are required to account for either the untimely receipt of services in C1, untimely evaluations, assessments, and IFSB meetings in C7, and untimely transition planning across all of 8. And include the reasons for delay. We found through our review that states who choose to report the children for whom the state has identified the cause for delay as exceptional family circumstances are providing the reasons for exceptional family circumstances, but not reporting the reasons for the delays. And we need the reasons for the delays. So outside of whatever happened to cause you to count something as an exceptional family circumstance and include that in your calculation, we're talking about all the other reasons. Those are the reasons you have to give us in terms of reasons for delay. And there are some places where states have talked about exceptional family circumstances, but not talked about the reasons for delay. And last on this slide, the OSEP, so C11 and B17. The formal OSEP responses you see in those indicators are generally tied to missing reporting requirements. So a failure to do something that's noted in is required in the measurement table. More often than not, that's tied to missing numerator and denominator descriptions in the FFY 2022 SVP APR data table. A state not having active links to a current theory of action or an evaluation plan. Those are some pretty common things that we see. But other issues are more about, anything that sort of leads into issues of quality or clarity. We are continuing to tackle that through ongoing TA and the conversations that states are having with their OSEP state lead. We are taking a closer look at evidence-based practices that are being implemented and how states are measuring fidelity, especially since we are so many years in to the OSEP implementation at this point. So your state lead may be asking additional questions about those things during clarification and as conversations extend into monthly calls and technical assistance moving forward. We know and recognize that the OSEP is at the heart of all of your efforts to improve outcomes for infants, toddlers, children, and youth with disabilities in your families. And we appreciate the work that you have been doing for these years, but also want to continue those conversations to make sure that we are supporting you and elevating those conversations about what you're doing to improve outcomes and how that work is going. Moving on to stakeholder engagement and representativeness. Has been the case for the past few years now, we're continuing to emphasize the importance of states building the capacity of diverse groups of parents. So beyond just increasing the number of diverse parents involved, I think we saw this last year, maybe to a lesser extent, but still present this year, when responding to how states have built the capacity of diverse groups of parents. There are some states that are still reporting on how they increase the numbers of diverse parents, but not how they've increased the capacity of those diverse groups to ensure that those groups are active and informed participants in the process, rather than just passive recipients of information. I mean, ultimately, the goal is everybody working together to improve outcomes for kids with disabilities. So, like I said, moving beyond how you're increasing numbers of diverse participants to how you're building the capacity of diverse groups of parents. Also want to flag that we're looking at this with a lens towards specific activities at the state level, rather than activities that are sort of offered to parents to support their individual child's development or learning. So what you're doing sort of at that state level to build the capacity of these groups to engage in these discussions with you. And moving on to representativeness, response rate, and non-response bias. So for indicators C4, B8, and B14, we're looking at a number of things. We're looking at the representativeness of the data, the response rate, and the identification of any non-response bias. Representative data reflects the extent to which the data collected represent the target population. And in this section, states should provide sufficient information to allow OSEP to understand how representativeness was determined. So we're in our review, and as we analyze your submissions, we're looking at the metric you say you use to determine representativeness, the demographics that were analyzed, and the results of your analysis. If a state's data are not representative, OSEP is looking to see that you're reporting on the strategies to improve the representativeness of the data. And those strategies should be specific to any subgroups that were underrepresented. If subgroups were identified as underrepresented during the analysis of representativeness, we're also looking to see that the strategies that you've implemented or that you plan to implement to increase the response rate are also targeted to those underrepresented groups. I mean, often we're seeing strategies being described, but they're not targeted to the underrepresented groups that have sort of bubbled up in your description of your analysis in your data. Lastly, when analyzing the response rate to identify any non-response bias, OSEP is looking for the state's description of the impact of those subgroups who did not respond as it relates to the data collected. Ultimately, the question that should be addressed in this section is how, if at all, did the underrepresented subgroups differ in their responses than those subgroups that were represented in the data? Is there a difference in the responses received early in the survey collection versus later regarding the level of parent involvement, for example? And if non-response bias was identified, what steps will the state take to reduce that in the future? I want to put a plug in for our TA centers who have done some incredible work to develop tools and resources to support states in this analysis to make sure that you're able to report to us the information we need. But a key point to remember in these indicators is that the strategies or the steps you're taking to improve representativeness and response rates while reducing non-response bias should be different. Yes, survey design and sampling methodology changes may be appropriate for one component, but likely not appropriate for all three. And like I said, once again, a big shout out to our TA centers for the resources they've developed and the tools to be able to support you in reporting on these concepts and those indicators. Now, a little bit about reporting on how you verify the correction of noncompliance. In our review, we found a number of places where there are discrepancies in what the state reported. So examples might be you have numbers in your tables that don't match what's in your narrative. And when that happens, then, you know, we're not going to accept your correction language. There are times that there can be discrepancies around the regulatory requirements that you are describing. You verified as being corrected, and they're the wrong ones for that particular indicator. So sometimes, like I said, they're cut and paste errors across submissions, or maybe you're looking at last year what you did and just trying to update, and in that cutting and pasting, it becomes a problem for us because it calls into question the internal consistency of your submission. There are also sometimes discrepancies from what you say year to year. That also calls into question internal consistency. So you just want to make sure that all of those things are matchy-matchy, as I would like to say. Also, please ensure that you're being responsive to prior required actions. Sometimes we've seen a few submissions where states have not spoken to those prior required actions, and we do need responses to those. Next slide is just reminding you about the incredible support you have out there. I know many of you utilize your TA centers during this time, and I encourage you to continue to do so. They're linked there. Also, there's some resources in eMaps like tied to the user guide and FAQs and those kinds of things about the system itself. So just reminding you that that is there. Last slide is a reminder of why we do what we do. I think even on my toughest days in federal government, there really is no more compelling reason to serve than the reason that I serve every single day on behalf of the 6.5 million kids with disabilities and their families. So reminder of the why we do what we do, and a big thank you. I'm sure there might be some questions in the Q&A. I'll take a look now because you guys know I can't do two things at once, and I couldn't look at the Q&A and talk at the same time. So I am going to take a look and see what's there. There are no open questions. Look at that.
Christine, there was just one question that I responded to.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, you know, we can wait a few minutes in case anyone has any questions for us. You just drop them in the Q&A. Or it could be that you guys are such seasoned veterans as it relates to clarification that you're already rocking and rolling, and you don't have any questions, and that's fine too.
Looks like you were crystal clear.
Maybe not. I don't know if I want to give myself that much credit, but I do remind you as
clear
well.
or stunned silence. I'm not sure.
Exactly. Your state leads are not only are your TA providers incredible resources, but your state leads, your OSEP state lead, that's your go-to person for any questions that come up during this clarification period. Please do not hesitate to reach out. These are the 2 weeks that we get to talk to you about your submission, and utilize that time well. So we're always here if you have questions. Though. See, good question. Under which indicator or location on the SPP APR do we upload the change form? You can, I'm trying to think of, I know my view, I'm thinking of your view. You can upload it under the introduction or on the attachments page. It doesn't have to be under a specific indicator, introduction or that general upload. We'll see it. And we do take a look at those, and please make sure that, I remember one year, this was a little traumatic. We want your changes reflected on the change form, but you also need to put them in EMAPs. It's not like official unless it's in EMAPs, because all of the data we collect has to be in a machine readable format in our system. So make sure that what you put on the clarification change form is also reflected within EMAPs, please. Don't forget that part. And I guess not seeing anything else, I think we can finish. Thank you so much. I hope that all of you are continuing to take good care of yourselves during what seems to be a continuous busy period, professionally and sometimes even personally. So take care of yourselves. Reach out if you have any questions, and we'll see you soon. Bye.